Hello and welcome to this webinar on the new permitted development rights. What do they mean for you? My name's Richard Garlick. I'm the editor of Planning and I'm your host today in partnership with Planning and Multidisciplinary Services Consultancy Stantec. Recently, the government has been adding permitting development rights so frequently that it's easy to lose track. So I should first of all make clear which rights we're talking about today. Our topic is not the proposed new rights announced by the government last week to allow the conversion of town centre uses such as offices, restaurants and shops into housing without a planning application. We might have an opportunity to get into that in the Q&A session that will follow our presentations. But our main topic for this morning is the permitted development rights that took effect in August. These allow for the upward extension of buildings to provide new residential space or flats and the demolition of vacant or redundant commercial or residential buildings, providing that they're rebuilt as homes. For this, I'm joined by 4 expert speakers who will be discussing this in depth. First, to explain how the new rights change the rules, we have Claire Fallows, who's partner planning at the law firm Charles Russell Speechlys and one of the top 10 highest rated planning solicitors in our annual survey. How are you, Claire, and where are you speaking to us from today?
All good, Richard, and I'm speaking to you from the village of Walken in East Hampshire, East Hertfordshire. I need to get the county right.
Fantastic, fantastic. Next on our list is and explaining the tests that the new schemes wanting to take advantage of these rights will face and how they might be addressed. We have Stantec's Director of Transport and Infrastructure, Scott Witchells. Scott's advised on many large development and infrastructure projects across Europe, including the Ebbsfleet Station development area and the Reading Station area regeneration, and also the Krakow Transport Hub regeneration. Scott, how are you? And are you in a glamorous European location today?
Very good, thank you, Richard. Not particularly glamorous. I'm in Wokingham in Berkshire.
Right, fantastic, fantastic. Great. And to explain the opportunities and challenges that this all presents to the private sector, we have Ian Fletcher, Director of Policy at the British Property Federation, which represents investors, landlords, developers and property managers. Ian, are you well, and where are you joining us from today?
Good morning, Richard. I am well. I'm at home, as you can see, in Thames Ditton, looking very festive. Got kids who are in the middle of their mocks at the moment, and this was a good escape for an hour to put up the Christmas tree and things. So.
Fantastic. Well, you're carrying the torch for the rest of us on the sort of festiveness front, definitely. And Ian's someone who's frequently quoted in planning, and to provide the local authority perspective, we have another long-standing contact of our reporters, Mike Kiley. Mike is chairman of the board of the Planning Officers Society, which represents public sector planners and also runs his own consultancy. How are you, Mike, and where are you speaking from?
Good morning, Richard. I'm very well. I'm speaking from a village called Longfield, which is in the Garden of England in Kent.
Fantastic, fantastic. So maybe not a very wide range of geographical diversity if we were doing something specifically on the home counties, but maybe not a massively wide range of geographical perspectives. But I think fair to say that we have got a wide range of sector perspectives, you know, from both public, private, and the law. I should say that I'm speaking from home in Reigate in Surrey, so not adding hugely to the geographical diversity, but at least sort of representing the fourth estate. So thank you all very much for sharing your expertise with us today. Each of our speakers is going to make a short presentation. After we're going to, after which we will take some time to hand over to your questions. So, without further delay, it's over to Claire, who's going to kick things off by giving us an overview of the changes. Claire.
Thank you, Richard. So I am going to whiz through the new permitted development rights to build up and to demolish and rebuild. The home of these is in Part 20 to the General Permitted Development Order 2015 as it applies in England. Worth a quick reminder as to what permitted development rights are. They are the national grant of planning permission subject to the detailed restrictions, conditions, limitations, etc. that are in the order, and there's a lot of detail in there. And also worth noting that, of course, permitted development rights can be removed by conditions, by Section 106 obligations, and by Article 4 directions. As you can see from the slide, all of the new Part 20 rights are subject to a prior approval mechanism. So they're not an absolute right, it's not a full planning application, but it's something in between. So looking at each of the rights in turn, and first of all, Class A. Class A deals with the right to construct up to 2 additional stories of flats on a purpose-built detached block of flats of at least 3 stories. So that's the main right. If you look at the blue box, there's additional rights that come with that. So engineering operations, works to install plant, access and egress, storage, etc. But you need to take care that the works that you want to do sit within the right. For all of these rights, there are exclusions. For this one, there are buildings whereby the residential use has come through a permitted development change of use, for example, office to resi. Buildings constructed before July 1948 or after 5th of March 2018. Listed buildings and conservation areas and other protected areas are excluded for all of these rights, so do note that. And then there are conditions and limitations as well. So as to the additional stories can only be constructed on the principal part of the building. And there's limits on the height of additional stories, the height of the roof, and any new plant that you install as well. Turning then to the next set of rights, which is classes A and AB. These are rights to add 1 or potentially 2 stories of flats onto either detached 3-story plus buildings or terrace buildings in commercial use. Again, you get the additional rights to do additional works. What is commercial use? Well, it's buildings that are in classes A1 to A3, or B1A offices, or other uses on that list, or a mix of those uses, or residential and one of those uses. And there's a curious thing that you also look at the use of the building as at 5 March 2018 too. For Class AB, buildings that are already being extended upwards, whether by PG or otherwise, are excluded. And also for Class AB here, we've got no windows allowed inside elevations. Then we have Class AC and AD, which deal with residential buildings. So adding 1 or 2 stories of flats onto terraced or detached buildings that are used as a single C3 dwelling house. Again, the additional rights, but note here that they don't include the right to construct plant on the roof, presumably because of the impact on the residential area. Exclusions, again, buildings that have already been extended upwards are excluded. And there are more conditions in terms of things to comply with, no windows in side elevations, exterior materials must be of a similar appearance to existing, so quite a lot to work through. And then finally, we have Class ZA, which is demolition and rebuild. So you can demolish either a single purpose-built detached block of flats or a building in B1 use and replace it with a single purpose-built detached block of flats, or if you want to do so, a dwelling house. And the additional rights give you those abilities to demolish the building, disconnect plant, etc., and also a temporary right to use scaffolding. A long list of exclusions for this one, including land and agricultural tenancy, unless landlord and tenant consents obtained, buildings where the footprint exceeds 1,000 square metres, where their height's above 18 metres, and buildings which haven't been vacant for at least 6 months. And there's no test on why they were vacant or what was done by way of marketing, just question of facts, were they vacant. Also an exclusion on unsafe and uninhabitable buildings in certain circumstances. And then there's a long list of limitations as well. So the new footprint can't fall outside the old footprint, and there is controls over the height, the number of additional stories. So a lot of detail to work through. That then takes me on to the prior approval mechanism. A long list of matters covered by the prior approval mechanism now. There's the different requirements for each right, so you have to work through that carefully. You'll see that design and external appearance comes up in each of them in a slightly different form. Adequate natural light in new habitable rooms comes up in each of them. Impact on amenities a consideration, both for existing, new and neighbouring premises. Noise, impact on trade and businesses, and for the demolition and rebuild, then a lot more detail required, particularly on heritage. And from April next year, we will also have the space standards to contend with too, and interesting that that's only coming in April. So what about the prior approval process? What does it look like? Well, for the details of that, then go to paragraph B of part 20. And look at the details that apply to your particular right. There is consultation, site notice and neighbour notification required. The authority must take into account the representations made and must take into account the National Planning Policy Framework as if the application were a planning application, so that's where they go to decide what tests apply. It can be refused if there's not enough detail or it doesn't comply with the requirements of the order. Must be refused if there isn't adequate natural light in all habitable rooms or the development's going to be contaminated land at the end of the process. Decision must be made within 8 weeks or longer period agreed in writing, but you can't start until prior approval is given. So there is no deemed approval and ultimately the remedy is to appeal. There is a fee and you will have to put in as a developer a report on the management of construction and how that's going to impact on amenity, and you have 3 years within the date of prior approval to undertake the works and notify the authority. So that is a very quick gallop through the rights, and back to Richard.
Well, many thanks, Claire, for a very, very concise presentation of what the new rights enable. As you will see, there is the space on the page beneath where you're seeing the presentations to ask questions. Please do ask questions. We've had lots of interesting ones come in already, but there's still opportunity to seek an answer from our panelists. Right, our next presentation comes from Scott, and Scott's going to be talking to us about the tests that the schemes wanting to make use of these rights will face and their position with regards to developer contributions and SIL. Scott.
Thanks, Richard. So yeah, you've heard from Claire the requirements and the procedures. So I just wanted to run through what that might mean for you as either applicants, developers or authorities. And of course, this, as Claire has said, you need to satisfy the tests, and that means the planning authority has to be accepting that you've submitted the appropriate information, and it absolutely doesn't remove the need to meet the planning test or the environmental considerations, and that's why the rules are very specific around this. So just picking up on some of those key themes that Claire's raised. For example, traffic and highways, the normal test for that through MPPF is the severe impact test. And particularly if we're dealing with older buildings here, those things may have changed since they were built. So access that was suitable at the time for the scale of building there at the time may no longer be suitable. So it's not a default that it will be accepted. Similarly, in contamination terms, a key issue for residential, the thresholds are high. You must demonstrate that contaminated land is not an issue. And that requires, it may require investigations, it may require further studies. Noise is a key one. Again, the noise environment of the setting may have changed, so make sure you take that into consideration. You've got to demonstrate compliance. There may be local authority standards, there are World Health Organization standards, and there are the standard tests for habitable rooms. So we need to look at those again, so it doesn't take away the need to consider those factors. And of course, this is important in terms of climate impact, flood risk. Typically, you need to prove there is no worsening and no further impact on flood risk. And then some of the other points that have been mentioned, appearance is a consideration, materials. Light is a very important one because that can be an automatic refusal if you can't satisfy the requirements for habitable rooms. And then, as we mentioned, amenity, space, use of space, availability of space, impact on other residents, and then air traffic and defence assets, which will have their own rules. We'll just quickly then have a look at what that might mean. All of these things obviously add cost to the application for the developer. They also add pressure to the planning authority to look at these in some detail and consider them. It could mean that your development that looks great may not be deliverable or viable at all. So it's important to do this work before you try to put the application in. But it may mean, as I said, something's changed. So you could be liable to contributions to traffic and highways, or even Section 278 works to improve access, for example. So you can't just assume because these PD rights exist that there won't be a need to change things or make contributions. As I said, on contamination, particularly for commercial sites that are being repurposed, there may well be contamination risk from those uses. Obvious one, conversion, say, from a garage or operational industrial site where the ground could well be contaminated. So there'll be a fair bit of work to do on that particular issue. And as I mentioned, in noise, that may mean you've got to undertake detailed noise impact assessments with noise monitoring to understand whether that noise environment has changed since the development was permitted initially. It could have been, way back in 1950, and you can still apply these PD rights, but the noise environment could have changed substantially since it was built. And that leads to a cost to you because it could mean higher insulation requirements or glazing specification than you would have assumed. Flood risk, as I mentioned, although the zone may have changed because of climate impact, if you're not increasing the footprint, you'll probably be okay, but do bear that in mind. It's something that has to be looked at. As I mentioned, air traffic, that could bring with it height restrictions. Defence assets, if the DIO has a consideration here, they will make the rules. So you need to check with them if you've got a impact on a defence asset, because that they will carry a lot of weight if they object. And as I mentioned, appearance, these things can be picked up with materials and good design. So it doesn't mean you can't do it, but it doesn't mean you can just put the cheapest stock material up and not think about the setting and surrounding. And then that light point, well, the costs are important. Additional glazing may be needed. You may have to put roof lights in where you wouldn't have done before. But that might have impact on adjacent properties. You can't put windows everywhere, as Claire has mentioned. It may have an impact on the noise penetration into the building and the insulation characteristics of the building to comply with building regs. So all of those things have to be looked at. And then the things you've probably got less immediate control over, the amenity space, whether that's reached its tipping point and there isn't any more capacity on the site because there's not enough amenity, or you have too much of an impact on existing residents and operators. And then that point about neighbour consultation, objections have to be considered and potentially addressed. So that's a bit of an unknown. You don't know how much weight will be attached to those by the authorities, and it's an important consideration to understand them. So in terms of what that means, the SIL payment system that you'll all be familiar with, the net additional rules still apply as they are now. So over 100 square metres SIL is payable, over 100 square metres increase. So that needs to be taken into account. And that we do know from speaking to various authorities that I've been involved and worked for, the permitted development rights for office conversions have had an impact on their revenues and supporting infrastructure. So they haven't been able, in spite of a lot of new housing coming forwards, they haven't necessarily been able to deliver the infrastructure. So government's proposing a new levy, and I'm sure this will be subject to a future one of these seminars, but they're aiming to replace Section 106 and SIL with a single new infrastructure levy. And the current plan is that will be a percentage applied to the development value. So when that comes along, we'll hear more, and that consultation, I'm sure, will lead to a lot of discussion and debate. One of the good things for developers is that will be payable on occupation, not commencement, in the current proposed draft. So just to sum up then, what does this mean in terms of infrastructure provision? Well, of course, it's going to be dependent on the scale of uptake and the number that come forwards that don't require to contribute anything. The key thing for communities is, well, you know, if you get more permitted development, right, and we're not providing new infrastructure, that might make the places less attractive and less saleable. So even from a developer's perspective, it might be better to invest a bit more and improve the infrastructure than to just try to sweat the asset that's already there and therefore create a less attractive place. I think this new PD will probably have a lesser impact than the office conversion PD because of the number of available sites and the scale of it. And all I'd finish on is to say, well, yes, this is going to speed up things potentially, but there's still a lot of detail and technical work to be done. And I would call out to developers to not just go ahead and build these things where and when you can, but think about the place, the quality of design and the community in everything you do. Back to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. That's very interesting. Clearly suggesting that you know, although there may be some opportunities for developers here, this is not a sort of walk in the park for them. There's quite a lot to consider. So our next speaker maybe can tell us a little bit more about some of the opportunities and challenges that all this might present for developers and property owners. So Ian, can I hand over to you to give a perspective from the British Property Federation?
Yes, certainly, Richard, and a very good morning to everybody. Got about a dozen slides, and I'm going to, I suppose, try to get under the skin of the developers. Going to do that mainly by looking at the existing office to resi PDR, and then relate it to the demolition and rebuild and the building up. Going to use a few case studies along the way and some statistics, particularly from the build to rent sector. We publish quarterly stats on that sector, and so I can get under the skin of that sector a bit more and understand how PDR has been used in it. My first slide is a bit busy, but is very contemporary, in that their housing supply statistics were out last week, and I suppose it illustrates how PDR is contributing to housing supply. So in the last year, about 5% of housing supply came through conversions, and only about 50% of conversions, I think, came through the permitted development rights. A second stat probably to draw out is that office to resi has been on the wane really since it was introduced, and certainly over the last 3 years we've seen a fall in the number of units coming through that pipeline from 17,750 or thereabouts 3 years ago to 10,500 this year. Pretty much accords with our experience, which I'll touch on in a moment. And yeah, apart from office to resi, some of the other sort of permitted development rights that have been introduced, frankly, don't really move the housing supply dial much. When you look at sort of light industrial to resi, the units are in the sort of double figures there, so not particularly important to housing supply. Just moving us on. For build to rent, as I say, we do our quarterly stats and split it into development that are complete, in construction and in planning. So overall, with about 800 developments in the build to rent pipeline now, about 14% have come through the permitted development rights on office to resi. But much of those are already complete. This was a way, I think, of a number of business models in the sector, so sort of kickstarting their models. And I've got sort of one or two examples to follow. But Not a lot now coming through in planning. 14 schemes. Many of those already have got permissions, so it's not really a significant source of build to rent going forward. Our members are looking for scale in the sector, and often permitted development conversions don't really provide the kind of scale that they're seeking. So my first example, a office building dominates Maidenhead town centre, and is one that has been developed by Essential Living. It probably wouldn't win the Sterling Prize in terms of its look now, having been converted into residential, but yeah, actually is well liked by its residents. We have a sort of trust pilot within the build to rent sector equivalent called Home Views, and this particular building rates above 4 out of 5 on a number of measures. Has good services, and clearly the residents, it's about 400 metres, I think, from Maidenhead rail station. So, as far as convenience goes, it's well liked. And a similar building from, again, Essential Living, right above Archway Tube Station. You can see from the white piece in the slide here that it's loaded with features and amenities to support its tenants, and again rates very highly, 4.68 out of 5 on Home Views. One from Platform Life. Platform particularly sort of focused on starting their model with a number of PDR developments across the country. This one in Bracknell is literally above Bracknell rail station, and very well managed, again, packed with amenities. And so far, Platform have done 8 developments, 5 of those in places like Bedford, Exeter. Stevenage have been through the PDR route, but their latest developments in Cardiff, Glasgow, Sheffield are done through the more traditional planning application. And just to underline that point, really, that I think so far as build to rent goes, the vast majority of opportunities have gone with office to resi, and the focus is more on delivering the more traditional route. And so the lessons, I think, in terms of office to resi, as said, certainly with respect to the build to rent, only a tiny proportion, best buildings gone. Not found it particularly a popular way of developing with our membership. You have to compromise on various issues. Ideally, in a build to rent development, you want to have 2 lift shafts, one with a service lift, because you're having people moving in and out on a very regular basis, and therefore trying to convert some of these buildings to residential use isn't ideal. Clearly location has been a key factor. From a sector-wide perspective, I think office to resi has allowed the sector to develop in places that it wouldn't have otherwise developed build to rent. So build to rent struggles in terms of viability in central London and in some of the sort of southeast commuter belt, and many of the developments, as you saw from my sort of second slide, are in those areas. Clearly significant concerns, I think, outside our sector in terms of how some of these developments are being used with temporary accommodation, offices on office parks that have very little in the way of community service support. And therefore, I think in sort of going then into the new PDRs, context has been critical for us. Just a passing example, this was a smaller permitted development at office to resi conversion in Surbiton done quite well. And I suppose our experience of government has been that the key focus for them was this sort of smaller high street opportunity, particularly for the sort of demolition and rebuild. And if I just really talk about our interaction with government over the demolition and rebuild. Certainly we were not particularly enthusiastic. The consultation phase lasted about 18 months. We'd not been particularly supportive of introducing this. Our members felt that it didn't provide them with significant additional benefits and had significant concerns about sort of placemaking and the impact, particularly on a high street, that using this sort of right would have. We met the Secretary. We had a very strange meeting with the Secretary of State about a week before the PDRs were announced. And I think some of the key issues for our members, again, this point about location and not being able to take account of that. For our members, the vacancy period was going to be probably too short. Initially, I think government suggested a year. They brought that down to 6 months. And in the current climate, they probably won't get to use it if it was going to be longer. Footprint and height. Our members are engaged in scale developments, and the 1,000 metre square and 18 metres really doesn't fit any sort of build to rent or significant development that our members would want to engage in. You've heard about the prior approval process, obviously, and also the developer contributions. A concern that our members expressed to the Secretary of State was just that all these PDRs are having an impact on planning resource and actually perhaps detracting planning resource from the kinds of major applications that they are making, and worry about that. And so overall, I think the fact that scale is smaller, that it has to be detached, and the sort of piecemeal nature of it probably doesn't mean it will be used very much by our members. And then very quickly,
Ian, I'm just conscious of time, so this is all really interesting stuff, but I want to make sure people have got a chance to ask questions. So if it is possible, just to bring it to a conclusion.
Get through this literally in 30 seconds. I think, the government's impact assessment, as I said it all, 8,000 units in 10 years. So I don't think this particular PDR, again, is going to be heavily used. I've shown an example of an extra floor on the building in the right-hand corner there. That was done through the normal planning process. I don't think that planning is the barrier to these kinds of developments. It tends to be other things which I've listed on the slide there in terms of rights to light, getting leaseholders support for the development, and all the practical challenges that engages in. You may have mobile infrastructure on your roof already, and negotiations on that. And government, I think, is seeing potentially modular as a solution to make the sort of construction side of things easier, but that doesn't get around, I think, some of the other obstacles that you're also faced with in these circumstances.
Thank you very much, Ian. That's great and really interesting to get a sort of close to the ground perspective from the developer and sort of property owning community. So our final speaker is Mike Kiley, and Mike is chairman of the board of the Planning Officer Society, which represents public sector planners. And Mike is going to give us the local authority perspective on this. Mike.
Thank you, Richard. I want to take us back to the there we go, the original permitted development conversion. I'm going to go through it in detail, but I think this was the start of this new sort of era of permitted development, where permitted development, whereas historically it was used to allow developments that were almost de minimis, couldn't have an adverse impact, and therefore could be given a general permission. or they were more extensive permissions, generally given to organisations that were institutions or sort of public bodies who could be trusted perhaps. But this is government trying to deliver its planning policies through permitted development rights. So it's a sort of a new era. And it goes back to 2013, early 2013, where before they introduced the PD, they were consulting on whether or not there should be exemptions. If you remember when it was first introduced, certain areas, I think the City of London was one, there were some weird exemptions through the country. So even then, government sort of accepted that one size perhaps doesn't fit all, but they seem to have forgotten that, and it's now ubiquitous across the country. So I was working as chief planner at Croydon at the time. The permitted development rights were put in place in 2013. That was going to have an extensive impact on what we were trying to do in Croydon, and I'll touch on that. But you know, we were required, along with others, to put in Article 4 directions, which we did a year later. But interestingly, previously Article 4 directions, you had to get the Secretary of State's approval. Now you make your Article 4 direction, the Secretary of State can intervene to quash it. So again, it's this sort of burden of these permitted development rights on local planning authorities, that they have to make the case that they're causing problems within their area, and they have to go to what is an extensive exercise of putting in place an Article 4 direction. So when it was put in place in Croydon, I think at the time we saw the largest number of applications. I think at one time, Richard, you might have reported that we had more than the rest of London put together in one particular year. So it had a significant impact. And I think what we've forgotten is one of the purposes of planning is to create a stable investment platform. And we had first-hand experience of this. At the time, we were dealing with an application for, it was a fairly modest 50,000 square foot office development by East Croydon Station, which we dealt with very quickly because we had to get it in place before the Mayor's Seal came in, because it rendered it unviable. But this was the first spec office development in Croydon for something like 20, 30 years. It got permission, it got built, and then the PD rights came into play. That developer had already bought his second site in order to produce another office development. But the market was so disrupted by the PD rights that he pulled out of the market and disposed of the site. We were also, at the time, encouraging the redevelopment of office developments within Croydon because we had too much offices, but it was done in a planned way. We were protecting the sites by the two stations, but the other developments we were happy to allow to be converted. And at the time we were dealing with Nestle when they moved out of their offices down to Crawley. And what we saw was a nervousness amongst those developers because they could get a PD conversion, a poor quality PD conversion next to them. So that role of creating stability in the investment market was undermined by these proposals. And the other thing that we saw was, frankly, shameful conversions. You know, there was a high number of units of 13.5 square metres. And that's getting close to a third of the size that they should be, if you look at the government's sort of standards. You know, it's about the footprint of a family saloon. It's smaller than a single garage. So you know, is this something that we can be proud of? I think something to be ashamed of, that we are producing the sons of the future. Now, government have recognised these issues, but it's taken them quite some time to do that. We had to have that appeal in Watford, which brought to light the light problems. They had units with no lights, but the inspector, even though he was saying that this was wrong, had to approve it. And then the UCL report by Ben Clifford has pushed government into bringing in space standards on the 6th of April. Plus, you know, we don't have any opportunity to deliver infrastructure that's necessary to support it. And this form of housing provision does not address affordable housing. Then the final point I want to make is the fees for these applications. £96 per application for the conversions, whereas the fee for a planning application would be £462 a dwelling. And this was introduced at a time when we were in the depths of austerity. So these have been, you know, quite a problem for us. and these new PD rights, which I'll come on to, will continue. And what we'll see, probably, government's out to consultation at the moment, is that the Class M and Class O PD rights are going to be removed and replaced with a Class E to residential PD right. So there's a much greater expansion because it covers more uses than the Class M and Class O did. So the slides have taken a little while to change. Here we go. It's done too. So the new permitted development rights introduced in 2 phases. 1st of August was the additional 2-storey on a block of flats under a new Part 20 Class A, and then from the 31st of August there were the other classes for various detached and terrace buildings that are either in residential use or commercial mixed use. Fee was increased, £334 a dwelling, but as I say, it should be 462. The notion, I think, in government's mind is there's less work involved in these. I'll come on to hopefully demonstrate that that's far from the case. The other thing I was going to briefly mention is that there is the Part 1 Class A PD rights to extend dwelling houses upwards, not quite like the rest of the PD we're talking about. It doesn't produce a single a new dwelling house. It just provides a conversion. I think we had a question about whether this applies to bungalows and can you do it in the green belt. Well, it's got very, very sort of similar restrictions. Effectively, it's 2 additional stories, but really only on a detached building. On a semi-detached terraced 2-storey building, you can only really add 1 extra story, and on a bungalow you can add 1 extra story. There's lots of constraints and restrictions, but like all of these PDs, they don't restrict PD in the greenbelt. So you know, you would be able, subject to meeting all those restrictions, do that PD extension in the greenbelt. So for the upward building, it's these have been covered, but my point really here is that there's quite a lot of stuff for us to check. You know, these exclusions, you know, was the building in place on the 5th of March 2018, and these dates are different for each of the PDs, and you know, is it older than the start date for the 1947 Planning Act? You know, quite a bit of investigation involved, particularly if the applicant doesn't include it, or you know, it's sort of questionable whether they based it on actual evidence rather than just assertion. So there's quite a lot involved in making sure that the proposal actually comes within the order. And again, we have to check a range of things, and these are being covered by Scott. One of the things I would say...
Sorry, just to say, I'm really sorry, because this is all really useful stuff, but I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah.
Would you be able to wrap up in about 60 seconds?
Probably not 60 seconds, no, but I'll go as quickly as I can, Richard. Okay,
I'm just conscious we've now only got 15 minutes left for questions, because we have got a strict time limit at the end.
Okay, so lots of things to check, but we now have to check compliance with the space standards. Again, affordable housing and Section 106 not included. On the demolition and rebuild, fairly extensive proposals here. Again, the fee is low. Again, similar things to check, but we've also got to check quite a bit of detail about the existing building, its occupation, whether it's got an agricultural tenancy, etc. In terms of restrictions on new buildings, there's quite a lot there again to check. I won't go through them because they've been touched on already. And again, the prior approval conditions, very, very similar to the upbuilding, but in addition, the demolition method, heritage and archaeology impacts, design and landscaping needs to be checked. Still no affordable housing or Section 106. So summary of the overall impacts. PD for new residential is getting much more extensive. As I've said earlier, the nature of PD has changed. We're now delivering government policy. Government has shown very little concern for local consequences. It's up to local planning authorities to put in place Article 4 directions, which is quite onerous. The prior notification is getting much more complex, and in some cases it actually involves more work than checking a planning application. We've not only got to check its impact, but we also got to check that the building is eligible for these works. The fees are below what is necessary to cover our costs, so there's significant additional burdens on local planning authorities. The important point is that this PD, coupled with some of the new use classes order, undermines many national planning policies. So planning is in the public interest. Is that the case with these, and given their potential impact? Town centre first and managing the future town centres, very hard to deliver now in this climate. You're delivering sustainable development, not really in our control to the extent it should be, and delivering good design, certainly in the early days, was not really possible. So the public are very confused, and frankly quite a few of the professionals are also confused. How likely is it to be taken up? I think we touched on the conversions. We've probably seen the peak of that. The hanging fruit or the low hanging fruit has probably been picked. We may see some activities in vacant retail units. I think the new restrictions on light and space will put off the charlatans that we saw in the early days. In terms of upbuildings, I think adding additional stories can be very, very challenging, expensive, structurally difficult. There might also be sort of legal constraints with the existing leaseholders, and it can be complex from a management point of view. And it's been PD for many years to convert the space above shops to residential, but we've seen very little take up of that, and it's probably for those reasons. And in terms of the redevelopment, Part 20, I think a limited number of buildings will qualify. Certainly in London, most of the stock is pre-war. The restrictions are likely to mean that planning permission is required in many cases, but also I think it provides suboptimal outcomes. So I think in many, because you're restricted to developing off the original footprint. I think these PDs are high risk for developers if they get it wrong. Richard, you reported on the case in Brent for Mercury House, and I think their main use quite often is establishing a fallback position, and then they come in to negotiate for the development that they actually want. So not quite 60 seconds, but
okay. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mike. And I had actually just been told that we've got an extra 10 minutes. So okay. That's great. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Mike. And I think an overall picture is being built up here of this potentially being quite a heavy burden on planning authorities. But also that from the private sector side, that this isn't necessarily a straightforward route, and some questioning certainly from Ian about whether about how widely it would be taken up. So we've had loads of questions come in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically I'll read out the questions, and then I'll ask people to volunteer to answer them, or it may be in some cases it's very obviously that there's a particular member of the panel who's most appropriate. But I'm going to, in most instances, so we can cover the ground, I'm going to basically ask for sort of one person to answer the question, and then we'll move on to the next question, if that's all right. So first question we've got from Maureen Smith from Barrow Borough Council, and she says, it seems to me in recent years too much of the PD changes have been based on the London southeast market, yet have been introduced nationwide. For example, there is no pressure at all for upward extensions in rural Cumbria. Is it time to have separate rules for London and elsewhere? Is there any, which member of the panel would like to address that? Okay, Mike, yeah, concisely, please, if possible, because we've got about 7 or 8 of these.
Yeah, I think what was interesting, when we were out to government was out to consultation on the upward extension PD, we had our planning conference in Stamford in Lincolnshire, and Steve Quatermain was there. And we had a sort of tour of that sort of beautiful, is it a town or a city? I'm not sure. And we're able to point out the unintended consequences of what was then proposed, and is broadly what's come out now. So I think I think whether it's appropriate physically for different parts of the country, I think is different from whether it's appropriate economically. And I suppose the argument would be that if there isn't a demand for it, then that PD right won't be taken up. But I take the point that I think the likelihood of that development, even in London, being economically and practically viable, I think is very, very limited. I don't expect to see much of it in London, let alone other parts of the country.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. We've got a few technical questions, and I suspect that some of these people may be able to answer immediately, and some of them may not. So I'll just say these together, and then if people can sort of I'll read this one out first. So it's from Asif Riaz, a director of Omniprop. He says, "How is the principal part, in quotes, of a building to be determined? If a building is 3 stories with a further level split into 2 cores, which are you allowed to extend?" So I'll give you a chance to think about that one. And then there's another question, which is, how will the LPA and indeed the property owner determine if the building is built before or after 1948? There will be many properties for which accurate records do not exist. Would first registration with the land registry suffice? And then a specific question to Claire, this one, which is from Yi Chung, who is a planner at Boyer. And the question is, where can we find more information on the term vacant under Class ZA?
So I'll start on some of that. I mean, I won't go into the detail, particularly theoretically, on whether something complies with the requirements, but those things are defined in the legislation, and what those decisions really mean may well come out of case law. I was going to pick up the 1948 point. I mean, that date is the day on which the 1947 Act started in operation, and those records should be available in local planning authorities. They should have the statutory register going back to 1st of July 1948. So there would need to be a record of that activity, i.e. the planning application being submitted, etc., etc. If that didn't exist, then I think in all these things you're dealing with the balance of probability. I think you would be certainly reasonable and probably right to refuse on the basis that on the balance of probability, because there's no record of any planning application that property existed before that date and therefore doesn't comply, and the onus will be on the developer to provide alternative evidence. So I think certainly that will be the way initially that I would be approaching it. And if that alternative evidence was land registry records, then we would have to assess those on their merits. Brilliant.
Thanks, Mike. Claire, yes.
Yeah, on the principal part of the building, I think there is a definition of that. It's something to do with you can't build on the side or rear elevations if they're lower, or something like that. So there is a starting point. Whether it answers the precise question, you'd have to look at it in detail. On the vacant point, I don't remember there being a definition of vacant, so it would be its ordinary sense of ordinary meaning of the word. And I think for that particular class, building does not include part of a building, so is the building as a whole, presumably, vacant, but that's something that people are going to be looking at in terms of what it actually means.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claire. Does anybody else want to comment on those questions, or shall I move on? Okay, I'll move on. So the next question is from Jonathan Baldwin, who is a director at Parrot Planning and Regeneration. And he asks, do the technical studies concentrate on the new additional units, or do they need to address the whole block, including existing flats, on issues such as noise attenuation? Mike, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those technical studies that address the impacts would I think in most cases, such as noise, relate to the new residents. But I think things like flood impact and highway impact are sort of cumulative things. So you know, they would look at the impacts or the impacts that the existing residents have on those things. I just want to pick up a point on flooding. I mean, flooding isn't just about the displacement of water, and therefore, you know, if you stick to the existing footprint, you're fine. It's also about the risk to human life. So if you are putting more people at risk, you know, in terms of flooding, and they would have to be evacuated if there was a flood, the fact that the water displacement is unaltered and the flow of water is unaltered is just one aspect of it. And I say that from my experience of dealing with planning applications and the advice we get from the Environment Agency. You know, there is they don't want to put greater strain on the resources that they have to evacuate buildings that are going to be, you know, sat in the middle of a flooded area. So, you know, depending on the issue that you're looking at, there will be a combination of, you know, looking at the impacts on the new residents, but also looking at the situation, you know, the cumulative impacts of things like traffic and flooding.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Okay, our next question is from James Elliott, and he says he's an architect from Elliott Architecture, and he says, does a planning officer have to consider permitted development rights which require prior notification when considering the acceptability of a standard planning application? I'm dealing with an application at present in which the permitted development scheme would be significantly worse than the submitted design. However, the case officer has stated they can't take the client's PD rights into consideration unless a prior notification application has been submitted and approved. Yeah. Okay, Mike. Well, thank you very much. Are any other offers to deal with that one? I do understand that it kind of plays into your expertise, Mike.
But this
experience.
Is a fallback position, and there's a whole bunch of case law on it, and I'm sure Claire will correct me. And I think that there has to, you know, it has to be a possibility, you know, a reasonable possibility that the fallback position will come forward. It just some theoretical fallback position is probably not enough, but it's not as hard as it's got to be likely or probable. So I think you know, that argument, you know, I don't know the specifics, probably I would think turns on that issue that what they're coming forward is some extreme theoretical PD situation, but you know, in order to give that weight, you have to ask the question: is there a possibility, reasonable possibility, of that actually coming forward? And the fact that they haven't pursued a prior notification proposal is perhaps an indication that there isn't that possibility. But to say, there's been quite a bit of case law on that over the last decade or so, I think.
Fair enough. Thank you very much, Mike. Oh, sorry, is there another? Sorry.
Right, Claire.
Yeah, that's great. Just maybe some slightly questions sort of feeding into some of the other expertise that we've got on the panel. Ian, what do you and Scott as well? Which of these rights do you expect to attract the most interest among developers?
I think, Richard, that for smaller developers, the demolition and rebuild will appeal to them. I think one of the challenges alongside the scale is the requirement for them to be detached, and I think government had envisaged that this would be a great way to repurpose our high streets. I'm not sure that is going to be the case. There's a lot of our high streets, it tends to be joining sort of terraced property. As I said, I think the building up, even government itself, the numbers look quite small. The game changer, maybe the latest announcement, obviously last week, and extent to which that new permitted development right has limitations on it, and if it doesn't, I'd noticed this morning the big shopping centre developer Hammerson saying that they were going to redevelop the Debenhams in Leicester into a build-to-rent development. You could see the new PDR being used for those sorts of circumstances. But we don't know all the constraints yet the government will put on that PDR.
Yeah, Richard, I'd agree with Ian on that. It's that attractiveness of the clean sites in terms of adjacency, in terms of demolition and rebuild, that gives you that wider opportunity. The adjacency point is key, and some of the constraints around that quite significant, that even though you've got PD rights, you still have to undertake those technical assessments. So there will be, I don't see this being the massive wave of new housing that the government may have hoped for.
Yeah, and there's another question here, which is if a submission is made without technical studies reports, will local planning authorities be likely to condition such requirements, or will the application be refused instead? So do we think that local authorities will be within their rights to simply refuse an application if the correct technical studies aren't attached to them? Scott, do you have a view on that? I'll ask others as well.
In simple terms, yes, because the requirement is to satisfy the planning authority that the appropriate technical studies have been undertaken. So obviously it will depend on the approach and the resource the planning authority has as to how flexible they are around that. But yeah, I mean, the idea of listing all these studies is to say you've got to at least have demonstrated these have been taken into account, and if you can't demonstrate that, then the authority can say that you is non-compliant.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Scott. Has anybody got anything to add to that, or should we've probably got time for one more question, which I'd like to put to the group. Again, we've only got a few more minutes left, so concise answers, please. But we mentioned at the start of the seminar the latest PD rights proposed by the government this week, which allow conversion of town centre uses like shops, restaurants, etc., or would allow, if these things go through, these conversions to housing. Just very quickly, what do you each of you think would be the outcome of such a change? Claire, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, there'll clearly be opportunities for some of our clients, landowners, developers, etc. And it might help in terms of bringing back buildings that are underused into use. But I think from a common sense perspective, then I'd be concerned that we're going to lose stock from commercial and retail to residential forever. I think our commercial areas deserve more intelligent planning than that. And I think particularly at a time when people are working from home more and moving to a hybrid homework, office work model, then there's a real chance for local businesses to grow and flourish. And this seems completely inconsistent with that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claire. Ian, what are your thoughts?
As said, I think this is a significant opportunity if government doesn't put the constraints that we've seen on recent PDRs on it. I share Claire's concern, however, that I think that the PDRs are all to residential, and we need, for the sake of good placemaking, to also make sure that we are delivering not only community uses, but I have a part of my membership that desperately needs last-minute warehouses in towns and cities these days, and is not going to get those opportunities, few and far between as they are at the moment. So perhaps we need a PDR to warehouses rather than always to residential.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. Mike?
Yeah, I think this both that use class and the PD that flows from it are frankly going to be disastrous. Yes, residential is really important, but so is jobs, so are our town centres, and the notion that the market will resolve problems, I just think is misplaced. We will see town centres that the town centres that do work tend to be well managed, either by the local authority, either by the landowners, the owners of the properties, or by organisations like BIDS. And as we move out of COVID and the online market becomes, much more extensive, our town centres will need to be carefully managed to give them a future, and it will be different in different places. And this, get on with it, do what you like, that will solve the problem. I just don't understand that thinking.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And Scott, final word.
Yeah, I think it really reinforces what Mike says. Successful town centres, particularly in the future with changing requirements, require a rich mix of uses to be successful. And yes, we probably need more flexibility in the planning system to enable that to happen more quickly, but there has to be a framework around which that sits that says, these are the broad pieces that we need for this town centre, this high street to work. And there need to be certain thresholds within that. And I think that's the missing piece, that those controls could be ignored by the PDR process.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to, we have unfortunately run out of time. We had several more questions, but it's been a really interesting session. Thank you all very much for your contributions. A quick reminder that the session is available on demand for 24 hours after the live session. So if you want to sort of go back and revisit any elements or pass it on to colleagues, please do. And otherwise, thank you all again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.